Thank you very much. Thank you, Wired Smarter, for having me. Diversity and inclusion are two of the most used and abused words in the workplace today. And so, in the short time that we've got, I really want to challenge the way that you think about it. I've got here the traditional diversity and inclusion narrative, but it's not that traditional. It hasn't been going on for such a long time. And with everything with the pandemic, it's transformed dramatically. So, I'm going to give you some really practical things in order to challenge your thinking, your perspectives, and to be able to help you as leaders in order to move forward. So a little bit about me, and I think Greg's already touched on this. I'm Dr. Jonathan. I work with organizations to make them inclusive, and I've got a PhD from the London School of Economics. This gives me the academic rigor that my FTSE 100 clients expect. And as you can see here, I'm the host of the Element of Inclusion podcast, which you can access wherever you listen to podcasts. I talk about my PhD a lot. Typically, I describe it as having a PhD in your problems. And so everything that I'm going to share with you today is not just my opinion, it's not just my research, it's the research of others, and it also comes from the client work that I've done. So it's a real evidence-based approach. Typically, when people talk about an evidence-based approach, they assume it means that you're collecting one bit of data or two bits of data. But an evidence-based approach has got many facets that we're going to be talking about today. So I just want to bear that in mind. We're not going to be talking in abstract terms. It's going to be very practical, very focused, and you're going to be able to take something from that. So my agenda for today is three things, really. One, I want to address diversity and inclusion in ways that you're going to understand, ways that you're going to be able to use. Second, we're going to address some myths. There are some ways that diversity and inclusion have been discussed in the workplace, in the media, that don't make sense, and they mislead and misrepresent the truth, and frankly it's holding us back in terms of reaching our goals. And then finally, we're going to give you some tips on how to win through inclusion. So that's what I want to cover today, and then afterwards we'll take a couple of questions if there's time. So first thing, you may have seen this, you may have heard this before. Diversity is a reality and inclusion is a choice. There's loads of things being said about this. Diversity is a fact. Inclusion is an act. Loads of things that are being said about this. Here's another one that you've probably heard of. Diversity is like being invited to the party. Inclusion is like being asked to dance. Now, these are things that are really cool to say at a conference. Great to say when I'm giving a keynote. But as leaders, is this something that's going to help you next Tuesday, next Wednesday, next Thursday when you're trying to create change in your organization? And it's limited in that regard. So what I want to do is to give you a couple of definitions of diversity and inclusion that are going to help you in your workplace. So diversity, there's a useful way to think about it. It's a management approach that recognizes that as individuals, we all have differences. We are not all the same, right? So we've got differences, but diversity as a management approach values those differences. It means that we're not all equal. We're not all the same. It also has commitments, which means that maybe it may be appropriate at times to treat people differently at different times when it's appropriate. Now, you may be hearing this and think, well, what about equality? But this is the thing, it's very different. And I want you to focus less on equality and more on inclusion. And so as you can see here, inclusion is a systematic business strategy to ensure that everyone shares the same advantages and shares the same benefits. The way we describe that is everyone can perform, everyone can belong, everyone can reach their potential. That should be the goal of creating an inclusive workplace. You'll notice that I'm not drawing attention to how people feel. People talk about belonging as well, and that's important. That's part of inclusion, but I don't want you to focus on some of the more emotive aspects of it. This is a very emotive topic, but you'll notice that I'm framing this in a leadership, in a management context, because this is how you're going to actually address this in your workplace. But what is the issue that you need to address? Well, we talk about the three biggest problems. And so my argument is, if you want to create an inclusive workplace, you need to address each of these issues. If you don't have an inclusive workplace. So what are the three biggest problems? People, potential, and performance. People means that organizations struggle to create a culture of inclusion where everyone can reach their potential. You've often heard this described as people from underrepresented groups, people who are from minority groups. Yes, that is part of it. But actually inclusion is for everyone. So you also need to engage people who are part of the majority. Everyone needs to come along. It's not just about the underrepresented groups. We need to ensure that everyone knows and understands what diversity, what inclusion means, so that everyone's able to reach their potential. The second thing is about creating a culture of inclusion where everyone can reach their potential. Culture eats strategy for breakfast. You've heard this, it matters. This is probably the lion's share of the challenges that you're going to experience in the workplace when you're trying to address inclusion. And then the last thing is around performance, the so-called business case for diversity. You hear all the time people saying the business case for diversity has been established, it's been proved. Organizations that have more diversity lead to more profits, better performance. However, whenever I speak to organizations, I'll ask the question, okay, diversity is good, it's useful, but how does it show up in your organization? Why is it good in your organization? Now, that's a rhetorical question. I very rarely get a meaningful answer. And this is the challenge. And this is something that I want to hold you to account to. What does diversity and inclusion mean where you work? And why is it good for the teams, for the leadership, for the organization where you work? In practical terms, not just because it's a nice to have, how does it help you to perform better? And this brings me to the next myth that I really want to address, which is around the business case for diversity. So you've heard people say that the business case for diversity has been established. This is a government paper. It's from the department used to be called Bayes, right? But this is what we call a meta study. So they looked at over 100 research papers. I think 64 were academic, 48 were from practitioners. So it's not just the academics having a look at stuff. This looks at everything. What they found would actually be quite startling to you. So I've lifted a couple of lines here just to share with you. And this is regarding the business case for diversity. And as you can see here, yes, there is evidence that organizations have reaped the benefits, but not all firms, in all contexts, at all times. So this generic idea of a business case for diversity, we have more diversity and therefore it leads to better outcomes, it's not true. It's not supported by the evidence. That doesn't mean there isn't a business case for diversity. There is, but you have to find it for yourself. As you can see here, how diversity is managed is crucial. There is no single approach. So it's really important to understand that specifically, because if you think that having more diversity automatically creates this beautiful outcome, and we're being told that in 2020, you're going to be disappointed. So you need to make sure that you're focusing on things that are relevant for your specific organization. The next myth that I want to talk about maybe, and this may upset some of you, it's about unconscious bias training, which is considered to be the go-to solution. If anyone's got any issues or challenges around diversity and inclusion, we'll get some unconscious bias training because that's going to help. Well, let's see what the research says. And this is from a recent paper. And what the research tells us is this. And by the way, I really want to draw attention to this. This is a real-world systematic review. What a lot of people don't tell you is that when they're talking about research, a lot of leadership research, organizational research is often done with MBA students, right? Based in North America. It's not necessarily done in the real world. This is a review of the research in the real world. And what they say is many implementations are used to reduce implicit bias, but the evidence is inconsistent. Robust data is lacking for many of the interventions. Does this mean that unconscious bias training does not work? No, but it does suggest that using unconscious bias training as a single approach, as a way to actually address diversity and inclusion, may be short-sighted. And it also shows that you're actually copying and pasting what everyone else is doing instead of thinking about what's relevant for your organization. And so the question that you're asking is, okay, great, I'm telling you what doesn't work, I'm dispelling all of these myths. So what should you be doing? What is the most effective thing to do? Well, what we do when we work with our clients is talk about the elements of inclusion. And there's 4 things here, which is social, support, systems, and solutions. So what does that mean? The first thing is social. You need to socialize people with inclusive behaviors and inclusive ideas. Participating right now, listening to me talk right now, I'm socializing you with regards to diversity and inclusion. I'm changing the way that you think about it. We need to do that on an ongoing basis as part of the cultures of our organizations. It's not just a one-off thing. It's not just a one-off intervention. This needs to be happening over and over again. We need to create inclusive cultures and we need to recreate inclusive cultures. The next thing is support. You'll hear people say, get a mentor, do reverse mentoring, or get a peer mentor circle. Once again, these things are useful in their place, but it's more useful to think of a developmental network. And a developmental network is it's a subset of your career network. So it's a career-focused subset of your social network. And so, quick question here. Think of anyone who's taken an active interest and action in supporting you in your career. Now, that could be anyone. And when you say action, that could be anything. So if I've got a niece who's 9 years old and she's an Excel whiz and I need to use Excel and she's coaching me, she's in my developmental network. The people who are in your developmental network using that is very powerful in creating an inclusive workplace. So that's something to throw out there. Who's in your developmental network? The next thing is systems. Most people run to this. They think of HR systems, recruitment, retention, promotion. Most people take that approach, compliance driven, dare I say, tick box. That happens regularly, but there's also some informal systems that are at play where you work. Even though we're in the pandemic, even though many of you aren't working in the office, you're not in the same physical space, there are informal systems of communication, and this drives inclusion or a lack of inclusion. Understanding what they look like and being able to create more inclusive behaviors is crucial to creating an inclusive workplace. And then the final thing I want to talk about is solutions. And frankly, I don't see this enough. This is the so-called idea. This is the golden ticket that everybody wants. We create an inclusive workplace and it creates inclusive solutions. We're able to create better products, better services. We drive down costs. We're more innovative. The argument that we have, and we're always looking for case studies, is if you've got an inclusive workplace, if you've got support, social and systems, it will create innovative solutions. So this is something that we're working with, we're always trying to see, and I would challenge you to look for innovative, creative, inclusive solutions where you work. And that brings me to the end of our talk. I'm happy to take any questions, any thoughts, but I challenge you, please, to really think and reconsider about what diversity and inclusion looks like where you work, and also put it into practice. Move away from the narratives and things that don't really work and move towards things that you can measure, things that you can understand, things that make sense where you work, not just generic arguments. Thank you.